Hey guys, so today we are comparing Canon's first full-frame mirrorless camera, the R, to their newest full-frame mirrorless camera, the R6. And I have to say that I'm an R owner and have been for a couple years, and I love my R. It's been my main camera for both photo and video, and yes, it does have some limitations, but for most shooters, I think it's very usable. And I got a chance recently to use the R6, and I will say on paper, it looks like there are some definite advantages to the R6 over the R, but also some definite downgrades from the R6 to the R. But when I got a chance to use it, I wasn't expecting to be that blown away by it. I was expecting to appreciate some of the upgrades, but not feel like I need it or want it over the R. But I was definitely surprised at how much I like this camera. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what I feel are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the two, what might be good or things that you like versus don't like, and which one might be right for you. So for specs, I'm just going to do a quick comparison overview. And first of all, the sensor, the R has a 30.3 megapixel sensor and the R6 has a 20.1 megapixel sensor. They both have autofocus that will work both in your viewfinder and on your back screen. And the R uses Canon's dual pixel autofocus. And the newest implementation of this is actually really good. It covers about 88% of the screen as far as where you can autofocus. But the R6 has Canon's dual pixel autofocus version 2. And like I said, version 1 was good, but version 2 blows it completely away. You can focus on the R6 100% of your screen, and they both have eye autofocus, but the R6 adds animal eye autofocus. In photography burst mode, the R, realistically in the tracking priority, what you can get from this camera is about 5 frames per second versus from the R6, you can get 12 frames per second with a mechanical shutter and up to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. They both have a maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. When it comes to video, the R can shoot 4K at up to 30 frames per second, but it is with a pretty big 1.74 times crop. In 1080, we can shoot full frame up to 60 frames per second. The R6, on the other hand, can shoot full frame 4K up to 60 frames per second, and there is a slight less than 1.1 crop, but that's less of a crop than we have on something like the A7 III in full frame 4K, so realistically, it's full frame 4K. The R6 can also do 1080 at up to 120 frames per second. On both of these cameras, we have built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. On the R, we have one UHS 2 SD card slot, and on the R6, we have two UHS 2 SD card slots. As far as built-in ergonomics goes, the Canon R series mirrorless cameras are easily my favorite cameras for ergonomics, and both of these cameras are great ergonomically. The R6 has a slightly beefier grip and I think might win a little bit over the R, but it's slight. Then onto controls, they both have two dials on top of the camera. On the R, we have the multifunction touch bar on the back, which I find usable if not perfect, but most people absolutely hate it. The R6 replaces this with a joystick and also has an extra dial on the back of the camera, so the R6 is the hands down winner for dials and joysticks here. Going back to the top of the camera, the R6 has the traditional mode dial here, whereas the R replaced that with a top LCD screen, and you change modes in the camera through a series of buttons. And I'll say when I first got the R, I didn't expect to like this because I thought it would be a little bit slower, but now that I've used it for a while, I actually really prefer this. It's really quick to change those modes, and you can see what you're doing inside of the viewfinder or on your back LCD screen. You don't have to move the camera and look at the top to see what mode you're changing to. So I definitely prefer the R here, though I will say a lot of people prefer the traditional mode dial, and it's definitely a preference thing. And now that we come to the EVF, they both actually have a 0.5 inch 3.6 million dot EVF, and they are great. However, the R6 also has the option to set the viewing rate to 120 frames per second, which is definitely a cool feature if you're filming something or shooting something fast motion. Now moving on to the back screen, they both have vari-angle flip out screens. The R has a 3.15 inch 2.1 million dot LCD screen, and the R6 has a 3 inch 1.6 million dot LCD screen. And I really like the R's screen. I think it's super usable and I've really enjoyed it. It looks great. and I thought it was going to be kind of a bummer that the R6 screen had less resolution and was slightly smaller, but to be honest, when I was actually using it, I didn't notice a difference at all, and I think the screen on the R6 is actually completely usable and really not a downgrade that you're probably going to notice. As far as battery goes, they both use a form of Canon's LPE6 battery, which is the battery that Canon's been using in full frame cameras for a long time. The R uses the LPE6N, and then the R6 uses an even newer version of the battery, the LPE6NH. Both of them are backwards and forwards compatible, which is really nice, but with the LPE6NH of the R6, you are going to get better performance and battery life than with any of the older versions of this battery. As far as ports go, they are going to have the pretty much exact same ports: microphone, remote shutter, headphone. They can both do USB-C charging. You have to have a USB-C charger that is rated for power delivery, like something that you would get with a MacBook Pro currently. They also both have some form of HDMI port, but in the R, that's a mini HDMI, and in the R6, that's a micro HDMI. And I'm just gonna say that a lot of people are going to have specific feelings about which one they prefer here. And then of course they both have the RF mount, which I think is just amazing, and I'm a huge fan of the RF mount. It's a big reason of why I bought into Canon's mirrorless series, and actually the fact that it is so versatile. You can also use all of your EF lenses and even EFS lenses on these RF mount cameras. So now to photography, and again, this is where on paper, the R6 kind of looks like a definite downgrade compared to the R, because you're going from a 30 megapixel sensor on the R to a 20 megapixel sensor on the R6, but that is not the case at all. The R6's sensor, first of all, don't forget, this seems to be the same sensor that's in the 1DX Mark III, and this sensor is really nice. The images are stunning coming off of here. In dynamic range, it's definitely a huge step up from the R. And even in color reproduction, I will say the colors look great off of both of these cameras, but with the R6, even in RAW, before you start editing, the colors just look better than on the R. Of course, again, the colors on the sensor on the R are still really nice, and when you're shooting in RAW, it's easy to match those colors anyway. Of course, the R does have more resolution, and you can tell that when you're zooming in. I will say you have to zoom in pretty far, but if you do, you can tell there is definitely more resolution here in the R. But the biggest differentiation between these two cameras is the performance, and that a lot of it comes down to the dual pixel autofocus version 2. And like I said earlier in the video, dual pixel autofocus was already really good, and I really didn't think the difference was going to be so stark between the two versions, but the version 2 blows away the version 1. It is great, it's fast, it sticks onto your subject, tracking is really good. If there are people in the frame, the shot is just going to be in focus. It's that good. Another big difference is the burst mode in photography, and I will say for me personally, it's not a big deal at all because I only ever shoot in one shot. I don't shoot bursts, but if you do, this is a night and day difference. First of all, even the fact that the R can only shoot 5 frames per second compared to the 12 or 20 frames per second electronically in the R6 is a huge difference, but also the fact that the 12 and 20 frames that the R6 is shooting does so well in tracking with the autofocus that all 12 or all 20 of those frames per second that you're shooting are pretty much going to always or very close to always be in focus. So you just have a lot more usable images that you're going to get from bursts with the R6. And one thing about how good this autofocus was, I was actually worried after shooting with it for a little while because I could tell that everything was just in focus all of the time. And I thought that it was going to make culling and deleting and picking out the best photos a little bit harder because everything was always in focus. There was no, first round of just going through and deleting photos that weren't perfectly in focus. But for me, it actually made it way easier because I could just pick out my favorite framing or poses or shots and not worry about whether or not they were perfectly in focus because I pretty much knew everything was in focus, so that wasn't a concern. Another huge upgrade in the R6 is the low light performance. And in low light, photos at ISO 12,000 tend to be still very usable, and even shooting at higher ISOs than that, 50,000, in some cases even 102,000 ISO, images can still be usable. And while the R's low light performance is good, the R6 just completely blows it away in low light performance. Another cool feature that the R6 has is in-body image stabilization. And I will say, this is one of the things where for me in photography, IBIS is not a big deal. I rarely, if ever, shoot telephoto beyond 85 millimeters, and I don't handheld slow shutter speeds. So for photography, it's just not a feature that I really have to have. But if it's something you want or need, it does work really well in the R6. However, for me, there is a little bit of a drawback here with the IBIS, because for shooting on a tripod or something where you're not handheld, in between shots or in between turning the camera on and off, the sensor can shift just a little bit and the photos don't line exactly up, which for me, when I'm doing work compositing images in post, that's going to keep me from being able to do that with the R6, because that sensor shifts ever so slightly and those photos just aren't going to line up right. Both of these cameras are great options, and I think both are great options for professional shooters. If you do shoot action, if you want the most dynamic range available, if you are someone who needs a second card slot to back up your photos, if you're shooting any type of animals or wildlife at all, then I would definitely say go with the R6. But if you don't need that, if those upgrades don't apply to you, or if you just want to save about $1,000, I still think the R is a very usable camera, and I think either of these options is going to be good for most people. So when it comes to video, again here, I think these are both great cameras. The R is a great 1080 camera. It can do 1080 up to 60, so slow motion you are limited to 60 frames per second, but for me that's perfect because I like to shoot 60 frames per second rather than 120 frames per second. Usually that gets a little too slow for me. Technically there is 120 frames per second in the R, but it's in 720 and with no autofocus whatsoever, so most people aren't using the 120 frames per second in the R. We also have C-Log for a little bit better dynamic range and better colors, but the R only films in 8-bit in C-Log, and that doesn't give you quite as much range to play around with the colors as you would get with 10-bit footage. And the R does have 4K, and the 4K is good, but first of all, you do have to deal with the 1.74 times crop, and the 4K is limited to maxing out at 30 frames per second. The R6, on the other hand, is a great 4K camera, and we get 4K up to 60 frames per second, which is what the R can do in 1080, but the R6 also has 120 frames per second in 1080, and with that 120 frames per second, we still have full dual pixel autofocus version 2 performance. We also get 10-bit 422 colors on the R6. We have C-Log like we have on the R, and we're supposed to get C-Log 3 added to the R6 at some point in a firmware update, which is going to give us even more dynamic range. I will say again, the autofocus performance on the R is still great, but it's way better on the R6. With the R6, the eye autofocus is going to find the eye, lock on it, and stay there. Even when people are wearing masks, it found the eye for me and did not lose it. Now, there are some potential problems with shooting in 4K on the R6, and that is the overheating. But I do really think that the overheating issue has been blown way out of proportion. I was shooting in outdoors 70 degrees, that's about 21 degrees Celsius, and indoors around the same temperature. And I was shooting 4K 60 clips anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes on and off for an hour to 2 hours, depending on the day, at a time. And I didn't even get an overheating warning. And usually the camera still said it could do 4K 60 for another 25 or 20 minutes. And I think that's completely usable for most people. I also tested shooting the 4K 24 for long form content, and I was able to record, again, 70 degree Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius, for over an hour in 4K 24, and that's more than plenty for any long form content that I would typically do. And if it does overheat, which I didn't even get a overheating warning after that hour, but if it does, you can still film in 1080, which is really the best that the R could do in full frame anyway. So for me, that's not a drawback. I think for a lot of people, unless you're doing a lot of long form content in 4K, it's not really going to be an issue in most cases. And again, I think it's overblown, and the overheating while there is not going to affect most shooters. Another thing we've heard about is the warmer color cast on the footage in the R6, and while I do definitely think that the colors come out warmer than they do on the R, I don't find it ridiculous. In some cases, I actually liked the warmer colors that came from the R6 better, but again, we have 10-bit 422 colors from the R6, so it's really easy to fix it to exactly what you want in post, as long as you're relatively close to where you wanted to be in the first place. Another problem that I would say you need to keep in mind is that the R6 can only film in H.265 and IPB only, which basically means that the footage coming off the R6 is much more heavily compressed, and that is going to be a lot tougher on your editing computer, and most machines, even modern higher priced machines, can't really handle this footage. So if you do go for the R6, just know that you're going to have to transcode in some form, whether you're transcoding to ProRes or using a proxy editing workflow. So the R6 is not really going to be the best option if you want a quick turnaround workflow. Now with the R, of course, you're basically limited to 1080 for the most part. And I will say the R6 1080 files are much more usable in bringing directly into your editing software and editing without proxies than the 4K files. But if you are looking for a quick turnaround workflow, I think the R with its all-I file capability is going to be a much better option for you. The R6 also has some really cool usability options that we don't get on the R, like for instance zebras. And with the R6, you can set 2 different levels of zebras to show up while you're filming. And while I would prefer that the levels were a little bit more customizable on the R6, we don't even have that option on the R, so I think it's a huge upgrade there. And then, of course, we also have in-body image stabilization on the R6, and I have been super impressed with the IBIS performance from the R6. It just gives really great, really usable handheld footage, even when you're moving around and panning. And I know some people have talked about the IBIS wobble that comes off of this, but that's really only an issue if you're shooting ultra wide, like 20 millimeters and beyond. And I don't ever shoot that wide. If you do shoot ultra wide often, then that is something to take into account. But I think for most people, that's not really going to be an issue. And the IBIS is so good when you pair it with lenses that have optical image stabilization built in, like the RF 35mm. The footage just comes out super smooth. And even with lenses that don't have image stabilization, you can still get really usable handheld footage. Another area where the R6 just completely blows away the R is in low light footage. And with the R is pretty decent in low light, but with the R6, even shooting at crazy high ISO values like 102,000 or even 204,000 ISO, the footage can still be usable sometimes. And I will say, I absolutely do not suggest shooting high ISO, especially that crazy high of an ISO, but if you come onto a situation where you have to shoot that high, the R6 is actually going to potentially be able to do that, whereas the R, that's not even an option. Now, I do still think that the R is actually a perfect option for content creators because, first of all, as a content creator, you really don't need 4K for social platforms. 4K is really just going to be a waste of time and memory space because they're going to compress your files down way more than that anyway, and the 1080 on the R looks really great and is going to give you a much easier, faster turnaround on your workflow. And when you're regularly creating a lot of content like that, that's something that really comes in handy. And if you do need to do long form content in 4K, as long as the crop on the R is not too big of a problem for that, then the R is going to be a little bit better for that as well, because you're not going to have the overheating issues in 4K like you do on the R6. But the R6 is going to give you much higher quality video and also better performance and handling. As long as you don't need long form content in 4K, I think this is going to be a better option for pro videographers, and especially because of the IBIS, anybody who's doing any type of handheld filming. So which camera is going to be right for you? And I would say the R is still a great camera if you don't need 2 card slots, you don't need fast burst shooting, you don't necessarily have to have in-body image stabilization, if you don't need the extreme low light capabilities, you're not worried about having the best of the best autofocus performance, because again, the autofocus in the R is still good, and if you don't need 4K 60 or 1080 120 in video. The R is also going to be a great option if you need more resolution in your photos for a specific purpose. If you do need long form content in 4K and you're fine with that 1.74 times crop, if you are something like a content creator and you need a quicker turnaround workflow and 1080 is fine for that, or if you're someone who just wants really good performance at a lower price point. But I will say the R6 is the better camera here. We have better video quality and better frame rate options. We have better image quality in photo despite having less resolution. We have the in-body image stabilization, and we have the much improved autofocus performance. Again, the R6 is not going to be the best option for a quick turnaround workflow. It's not going to be the best option if you're doing a lot of long form content in 4K because of the overheating issues. But despite that, and despite the higher price point, I really feel that the R6 is one of the best values for the price point right now. So I hope that you enjoyed the video. I hope that it helped you if you are looking at the differences between these two cameras. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. In the comments below, let me know, are you looking at getting one of these two cameras? Are you using one or both of them already? What do you think about them? If you are thinking about buying one of these cameras or any of the other gear I've mentioned in this video, in the description below, I'll leave affiliate links. And if you purchase through these links at no extra cost to you, you'll help support this channel so that I can keep making videos for you guys. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See ya.